All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here, Emancipations podcast. Very happy to welcome Helen Rollins to the show.
Hello.
Helen, how are you?
All right. We were just discussing off camera the struggles of being a parent to a baby.
Yes, indeed. We had to reschedule due to winter
Child.
colds and things of
Yeah.
that nature, but it's very fabulous to meet you and to have you on, Helen. I've really admired your work from afar, listening to your various interviews and discussions in the wider cinematic left-wing Lacanian podcast world. One of the great things about Helen's work is that Helen is based in the film production industry, and we'll learn more about where you reside within that interesting world. But Helen has also done a lot of work in Lacanian theory. By that, I just mean you've really studied your Lacan, and it shows. Because, yeah, we're talking about your new book called Psychocinema, which is a sort of very, very concise account of how the Lacanian conceptual apparatus fits into film theory.
Mhm.
Of course, you have thinkers like Joan Kopechek. We did a huge program with Joan on Kiarostami.
Mhm.
We have Zizek. We have a number of Lacanian. Todd McGowan is the sort of the pioneer of this field, right? I think you reference all of these figures, but at the same time, Helen, you are developing your own sort of language to get at cinema.
Mhm.
And there's a political dimension to your presentation about cinema. But perhaps, Helen, we might start with your main thesis in Psychocinema, right? Which is that the film experience, kind of as such, can be understood vis-a-vis Lacan's theory of the discourse of the analyst.
Yeah.
I'd see that as your central theme. Maybe that's a peripheral, but I see that as very central, or maybe your most original argument.
Yeah.
In the sense that a lot of other Lacanian theorists maybe aren't hitting that point precisely.
Yeah.
So that is very interesting, because to me, what that indicates, and I want to invite you to elaborate on it, is that at the core of the film experience for the subject, for the spectator, for the viewer, is a kind of transference that is analogous or sort of homologous to being in free association on the couch.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Tell us about this.
Yeah. So I guess always wanting to be, I don't know if I want to or not, but I feel like I'm a little bit of a sort of take the opposite argument type person. Au contraire. I once said, so you guys don't have Marmite in America, do you? Marmite is this yeast extract spread in the UK, and its whole marketing strategy, it always has been, you either love it or you hate it. So, I'm pretty ambivalent about Marmite, and Alfie said that's my most contrarian take, because you either love it or I sometimes. Anyway, back to this. Yeah, I sort of have found myself over the years getting a bit sort of like, is this right, about the way that, not Lacanian, I would say, film theory, but film theory that utilizes Lacan in a sort of scientistic university discourse, let's say, deviant from what I would say Lacan's actually getting at way, sort of says the opposite to this. So it's all about mining what the hidden message is, and we're so clever, we found it, and what was going on in the mind of the director and all this kind of thing. And I sort of think and this is maybe influenced by being a kind of practitioner of film, and what I think film does practically on the viewer, rather than, this sort of university discourse theorizing it, but in also thinking about Lacanian theory sort of separately and together, that film, maybe we can think of it less as I don't even want to say text, because text can be read really productively through a Lacanian lens, but this sort of, I would say, critical theory ideological version of using Lacan or Lacanese or whatever. Something that is, it's really hard to articulate how influential a text like Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema has been on film production and on the study of film. And this is something that I is Lacanian in name only, let's say. But we can kind of, I also am a total people pleaser, so I don't like criticizing people, but this is just, I think I'm not the only person to say this. I think this is sort of well known relatively.
You're suggesting that this influential text is theoretically flawed? Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Because the thing is,
you seem like you're worried to offend the people involved.
I don't like offending people.
That's very kind of you, Helen.
Well, this is the thing. It's just cowardly, though, isn't it? Anyway,
well, we are a place for critique and polemic. Okay.
Well, actually, the thing is, it is a sign of respect to
sure.
criticism as well. So, I think the real issue with that text is not necessarily, some of the contributions it makes, and this is written in the early 70s. There is an issue of questions of like male dominance and quote unquote patriarchy, all these things in film production at that time. And it's very useful and important to make the critique at that time. But it uses Lacan, I think, and I'm pretty sure this could be one of these like made up memories, that there was a big phenomenon of people inventing traumatizing memories at a certain point in I think it was in like police investigation. So I could have dreamed it, but I'm pretty sure I watched an interview with the author, who is now, I think, in her 80s, saying that she never actually read Lacan.
I see.
So I could be allegedly.
So let's take a step back. So on the one hand, the text show that there's a kind of causality to theoretical conceptualizations coming from the world of philosophy, theory, and in this case, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and that how then did this affect the production of
So what this film, what this text does is the classic oneness and alterity, identity is closure argument. So it's the classic sort of, the problem is X and the essence. So it utilizes Lacanese to essentialize, let's say, male desire, rather than problematize it or expose a universal lack in it, which I think is the political gesture of psychoanalysis, so to hystericize. And so what this does, it becomes, anytime you promise this oneness and alterity, especially when it's lubricated with the discourse or the aesthetic of critique of, something radical, but is actually fundamentally, structurally, philosophically, completely in line with the capitalist discourse, it becomes popular and it becomes influential, and it just basically represses the contradiction further via culture.
This reminds me of Kopchek's intervention into the concept of the gaze and the false application of the Lacanian use of that concept by film theory. But my question is, and maybe you could help me understand this. How do the world of film makers, producers, writers, etc., relate to theoretical production? Because one could say it's very likely that theoretical perspectives are quite distant from the horizon of their own conceptual worlds. Is that accurate? You're seeming to say that no, in fact, these debates in theory mean a lot to the actual movie makers.
Yeah, I would say, the thing is, movie makers have been through literature courses, humanities courses. Obviously we had a massive expansion of the university as a consciously proposed way of elevating us economically, but actually in practice debasing and proletarianizing us. That's a whole separate thing. But we have, there is a crossover in terms of the academic institution, the university, and the cultural production sphere. Film schools teach this stuff, as part of, let's say if you're doing a practice course, you'll do a film theory course, you'll do a how to read a film sort of thing. But I think, the Laura Mulvey essay, narrative, visual pleasure narrative cinema, is introducing this male gaze in the complete sniff, precise opposite of what is actually meant. And this sort of mystification, let's say, archaeolization, maybe like it's just beneath the surface, we've got to find the truth, is part of the, let's say, just as psychoanalysis becomes, let's say, the therapy commodity and steps away from the analytic discourse to the capitalist discourse, the critical theory as an analyst's discourse of, let's say, a cultural product to help us understand the workings of the economy better, it becomes a mystification process. So this is classic like university discourse. So, for me, reality, what's interesting about psychoanalysis is helping us come to terms with something that's before our very eyes, rather than creating, let's say, aesthetic veils through the question of, oh, but we're opening a veil. This opening a veil requires a veil, sort of thing. But this question of gaze, and you see it bandied about in culture from the male gaze. I've seen the white gaze, the rural gaze, the this, that, and the other. I mean, it's really Foucault they're talking about, not Lacan. Lacan is sort of saying the precise opposite, which is gaze is not about power dominance, let's say in Foucault's medical gaze, which is an important thing to look at in terms of power and how, let's say, structural systems of power affect the way that you were envisioned or the way that you relate in your position in society. But gaze is about the exposure of the lack of desire in the visual field. So it's like a remnant. It's like a whiff of death. It's like the impotence in desire rather than the sort of ascribed dominance of the man. And I think in the book I use vertigo, a scene in Vertigo, as a way of it's because in that essay it's read in this phallic camera shows this guy's in the police, this is which you can say is a critique worth making from that perspective. But Lacan's contribution is saying the opposite, and the sort of aspects of this precise scene show us the lack in the desire or the fundamental fantasy of the protagonist, which tells us something about desire as such. And if we extrapolate the economy and the way we structure our society in non-emancipatory ways, and this is universal. So the lack is always universal, not this identitarian essentialist question. And the thing is, all of these critiques of categories of identity, that sort of question of power and dominance, those are important, but this isn't what Lacan's getting at. Lacan's getting at something different to do with ideology, desire, and fantasy. And that's the case. And I think that the thing that's kind of difficult with the way that Lacan is, let's say, Rubik's cubed and kind of like messed with this essay is that people think that that's Lacan's contribution, whereas it's, let's say, potentially Foucault's contribution, and Lacan is offering something with respect to film that is so important and vast and powerful, and is just brushed over because in his name something else is being said.
I see. That is very helpful and very interesting. And we'll get back to this relationship, I think, between the institutional kind of world of cinema production and how it intersects with film theory and the university discourse or academia and so on. Because one could add a kind of sober note regarding the decline of literacy, which has been a huge issue and frankly, one of the most terrifying cultural realities, I think, in the last 10 years. or maybe since the invention of the iPhone, I'm not sure, but,
Yeah.
yeah, but okay, so let us go back to our ground floor claim that
Mhm.
you make in Psychocinema regarding what Lacan actually is offering to, an understanding of the what you call the collective, transformative artistic experience that can guide viewers in what you say emancipatory small doses.
Yeah.
Some films achieve this. So you're
Yeah.
sort of saying that Lacan gives us a way to also, and correct me if I'm wrong, provide a kind of apparatus of judgment onto the aesthetic analysis of films and cinema.
Yeah. So
That's very interesting. Yeah, help us understand that.
said this frequently, actually. I remember listening to a lecture years ago that he gave, that his perspective is the most political films are the most aesthetically brilliant films. And he would argue that, not to put words in his mouth, and I'm again may have made up these memories, but it's funny how you sort of ingest and then sort of redigest and what have you. But that the great films, the ones that really last, are those that touch on an experience of our subjectivity that we could call maybe emancipatory song. The thing is, all of these words are kind of tricky, because as soon as you turn it into a promise, and I've heard people say, I don't like the Slovene school, and when they say, emancipatory this, emancipatory that, and it's true, it's like with Marx, when there's sort of a horizon of promise, this can become a commoditized sort of version that just perpetuates the whole logic of capitalism. But I think that this emancipation question, if we're taking it like at the way in which we hope it to be expressed and accepted, is this question of universal lack, and that basically film, and I think in the book I argue it's to do, there's so many ways in which sort of contingently it came about at this specific period of time, and the way it functions mechanically in terms of this seventh art, all encompassing, you have the visual, the auditory, the performances, all this kind of stuff, that it's to do with a transferential relationship with the film itself. That is, I do think films can achieve it in lots of different ways, but possibly I think one of the most powerful ways is through the question of plot, which I remember I was at one conference and some literary people got a bit like, excuse me, you can't say this because plot is bad, story is good. And plot is Hollywood. Fragmented poetic is what the art's all about. And it's like, I beg to differ. So what I kind of argue is that the plot, or let's say a form of narrative that is historical, but it happened to, let's say, find its feet in a certain way, potentially in Hollywood golden age, it is able to mobilize our desire in a certain way. So in a sense, it is liturgical. We could look at it as a sort of potential machine of desire that gets us to invest in a story, in a form of desire, in a protagonist's desire, and that potentially, like the analyst with the play of transference and countertransference, you can only, like psychoanalysis only works insofar as, even if we, as psychoanalytic cultural theorist people who know it doesn't work in this way, we invest in the knowledge of the analyst. And we have to do that in order to reach a stage where we can be disabused. So this is an argument made about Christianity a lot, and I think I go into this in the book, that only a Christian can be an atheist. It's a sort of Hegelian point, that it's really going there, that the temple curtain can rip and you can experience potentially a death in your desire by having your desire mobilized. So I actually think that potentially the most powerful, from a psychoanalytic perspective, forms of film are not the sort of airy-fairy, fragmented, oh, doesn't it look amazing? Oh, so clever. It's maybe something a bit more guttural and a bit more desire-based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so many film critics identify Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which is the film you analyze. And
Yeah.
maybe we could begin with a kind of spotlight of sort of here's an empirical example
Yeah.
to sort of run through what you've just outlined. Maybe you could help us kind of use this film as a sort of lens into how you are articulating this Lacanian application.
Yeah.
And then actually I want to go back to mm, kind of unearth a few points of clarification on the term discourse. What's the discourse theory? The discourse of the analyst in the university.
Yeah.
I mean, on the channel, Emancipations, folks can see a lot of Lacanian theory stuff we've done, but I think it would still be useful. But
You
so
did a video recently about.
yeah, I mean, it's very well. We did a huge thing on McGowan's book.
Yeah.
We do study groups on Lacan every Thursday. We study Lacan.
Yeah.
Right now, we're doing the seminar on identification. But what's interesting about Citizen Kane, of course, from a Lacanian point of view, is that it begins with the signifier of rosebud. And
Yeah.
I've always thought, like,
Yeah.
okay, what's the Lacanian take on this idea? This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
this is very, very significant because it's like this missing signifier that the subject then has to like reintegrate and right. And so maybe you could, as an exercise, kind of walk us through Citizen Kane.
Yeah. If I can remember, because it's been a while since I wrote the book and then a while since I watched, so I might get names wrong and things like this. But I think Citizen Kane is, I mean, of course, it's one of the great movies. Do you know, actually, funny little anecdote? I was at a film festival like years ago, just walking around, and this was in the time of BuzzFeed. I don't even know if BuzzFeed exists anymore. This was maybe 12 years ago or something. And BuzzFeed was going around to sort of ask people working in film what the most embarrassing film they haven't seen that they pretend that they have, it's important. And at the time it was Citizen Kane. And then after that happened, I was like, I better actually watch it. And it is actually, the hype is real. The hype is merited. So it starts with this signifier, rosebud. And so it centers around a man who dies, this industrialist. And he utters on his deathbed this word rosebud. And because of the import of this guy as a major figure at the time, this leads journalists to sort of question what this word rosebud means, and goes on this sort of journey to investigate. And there's people who kind of let's say speculate or whatever, but I mean, blah blah blah. The main thrust, and this is the bit that grips us through the narrative, and then the end, the final scene, we come to find out after the journalist has failed in finding out what it is. And there's a sort of a flashback scene, and it's when the figure is 8 years old or something, and it's a winter's day, and he's playing with a sledge. And basically this day is like the last day of his childhood, because he's sent off to become a man with this industrialist who'll kind of like educate him into becoming what he ends up becoming. And the final shot of the film is the sledge being burned, and the word that's etched on the sledge. So the sledge was called Rosebud, and it goes into flames. So this does sort of follow this Lacanian idea of we're gripped to find out what this mystery signifier is, and then it turns out it's sort of this ephemeral nothing. But the question here is to do with heaven, or Eden is Eden insofar as it's lost. The breast becomes this excess loaded object insofar as it's lost. This childhood moment becomes retrospectively loaded with fantasy and regret and all these sort of excess affect modes of relation, precisely because it ended. It becomes much more than just this word rosebud. So I guess the two things are this sort of journey of trying to navigate and find out what this could be, only to be let down that it's nothing. but the nothing becomes much more than something precisely because it's lost. Yeah.
No, that's very fascinating. And but my question would be about, in a sense, okay, the plot. Okay, what, in your view, makes a film capable of achieving a transference? Because one could say,
Yeah.
from, let's say, a counterintuitive point of view, like a lot of my viewing habits, and maybe you would confess this as well,
Mm-hmm.
prefer mediocre movies, in the sense that I engage with them to conceptually tune out. In other words,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
As a relief to, because I'm, whatever, I'm a scholar, I read all the time. And when I watch a movie, I want to fall into a kind of sub thinking state.
Yeah.
So, of course, yeah, the stupid Netflix movie or whatever is enjoyable for that reason.
Mm.
In fact, maybe cinema attention to highly um, m- you know films that actually touch and pry into our desire,
Mm-hmm.
is that too much? I mean, that's very difficult. In other words, like for me, actually, I need to be prepared
Yeah. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
experience, right? We even think of like young people today, like, oh, don't trigger warn me, don't
Yeah.
trigger
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
So there is a certain sense in which the grandeur
Yeah.
of the cinematic experience that cuts you and
Yeah.
makes you feel and so on, have we lost the desire for that because
Well,
of its brutalism and its
mm,
difficulty?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, is that or is that maybe I'm being too pessimistic, or
It's
yeah.
particularly difficult for, let's say, from the production side, um, to get these films made in today's scene. You will often get things like, oh, people just want, um, escapism, or can't we have something happy? Um, but I guess the question isn't, happy or not happy, because you can have a miserable film that's actually the most ideological thing or whatever. But I actually think that the contradiction of the economy is so repressed that it is so uncomfortable often for people to view this kind of film. And historic works like Citizen Kane, etc., come with a whole cultural history. We know it's a good film, it's a great film. It has, let's say, cultural approval, all this kind of thing. But I would say that, yeah, because you talked about media literacy, or even reading, and I'm so guilty of watching. I actually think the worst thing for cinema has not been AI, but Instagram Reels. Like, my attention span is done. Although I do find that a great movie will really bring me in. If it really is good enough, I'll actually put down the phone. But I mean, this is a question as well of how films are financed and the whole economy of film, which is a whole different but related topic. But there is almost, it can be too traumatizing and too anxiety producing to actually confront the veracity of the status of subjectivity in our world, because I think it is very far gone. And that does worry and upset me. But yeah.
So this is not an argument per se regarding the decline of the auteur or the decline of, I don't know, the capacity for the generation of genius directors and so on. So how do you understand excellence in cinema? And so there's the political economy of the production world of cinema and its austerity and various things we can elaborate and so on. But at the same time, are there not amongst us today still great auteurs, still great directors that are capable of creating films that achieve this type of accomplishment that you are articulating?
Yeah,
Of course there are.
absolutely, absolutely.
Uh, okay, so we'll turn to the political economy of cinema and production in a moment, but let's go back to the Lacanian apparatus, and I want to drill in a little bit more
Mhm.
because Zizek has famously argued that film presents for the spectator a kind
Mhm.
of perverse
Yeah,
subjectivity.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you don't deny that,
yeah,
but you rather say that it's maybe more productive to think about the effect on us
yeah,
as hystericizing.
yeah,
Yeah. So that's very interesting. Talk
yeah.
about this distinction,
Yes.
why you think, because I guess I read you as saying, yes, in fact, a hallmark of a
Yeah,
film that cuts us, that touches us.
yeah,
Because again, if the analogy to watching a film is like being an analysand,
mhm,
right? Meaning like being in on the couch, as it were, the director is making scansions on our unconscious, is
yeah,
directing those, directing our desire in a certain way and leading up to instantiating a fantasy that we fall for as the viewer,
yeah,
and right, and then pushing us out.
yeah,
So, but how is that hystericizing? I mean, it's not to say that you're valorizing the hysteric or celebrating. No, it's slightly different. What is this all about?
yeah. So Zizek obviously famously, and this brilliant couple of documentaries, Perverse Guide to Cinema, Perverse Guide to Ideology, he's basically, he says, and I think it's one of the trailers, this clip where he says, cinema is the ultimate perverse art. And it's, this question of the perverse subject telling us how to desire and what we desire. And this is the hallmark of advertising. So capital, as articulated in Mad Men, I think Don Draper is a very perverse character. There gets to a certain point in capitalist production where it's no longer just possible to tell people you really need this, buy it because it's so useful. There's questions of the falling rate of profit and all this kind of stuff. So you have to find ways to mine an excess in the subject to spend their coin to generate more value for the capitalist by not only saying this is useful, but mobilizing the desire of the subject towards, you know, a product, basically. And so Zizek's talking about how film is is an art form that does similarly to this kind of Don Draper-esque advertising capitalism, which does something to our desire in that it directs it and it shows us how to desire and it teaches us how to desire, it shapes our desire. This is all true. I absolutely do agree with this. But I actually think that we can maybe take it a step further in terms of this political question of cinema and what I think maybe might be lost going forward in cinema. Although I think there's always a possibility to read things in a certain way. And I think that because of the very nature of this art form as it evolved, it sort of does this as part of its structure. And so I think when, part of the reason I think people have lost interest in films in lots of different ways, it's partly to do with the cost of going to the cinema relative to the cost of living. But it is precisely this way in which the collapsing rate of profit has informed the necessity of cultural industries to run cover for, let's say, the countervailing tendencies that have emerged in corporate capitalism. And this has led to films being less enjoyable and less good. But basically, yes, so this question of hystericization, this is, in a sense, the goal of the analyst. There's a sort of this feminist critique often about like, oh, it's so terrible that Freud used this word hysteric. It's so mean, this is a loaded Victorian term, which is about being a crazy woman or whatever. But actually, the hysteric is the peak, in terms of the psychoanalytic insight relative to the emancipatory, let's say, impetus or result in some ways of psychoanalysis, which is to experience your own lack in your own subjectivity and recognize your position in society and the universe relative to the other who also lacks. And
Right.
obviously there's questions of like how a hysteric subject may suffer being able to do that experience, to have that experience, but many subjects, have the capacity to do that experience, which is something that is really there in Lacan. He says there's a latent hysteria in all subjects in the universe, but they haven't even got to that capacity. And that psychoanalysis really, this is the ordinary unhappiness. We're left with the, what do we do with the fact that the truth that we come to digest, hopefully, that we are lacking, that the universe is lacking, and that the other lacks as well. And yeah.
I love that, Helen. So okay. One of the arguments you make is that capitalism has a drive that is in its own way utopian.
Yes.
And this is very interesting, but it's obviously a bad utopia.
Yeah.
Because, and this is a fundamental point, the drive inducts us into something which cannot address this problem of fundamental lack.
Yeah.
And this circuit of capitalist consumption, I mean, it's sort of a theory of the viewer as a consumer and inducted into a process whereby their experience as a consumer in capitalist society is ultimately a frustrated experience.
Yeah.
Because the system of commodity exchange, which is the sort of general logic of social, of our social subjectivity, is deprived of this confrontation with lack. So therefore, the kind of universal claim you're making is that the emancipatory dimension of film can be seen or can be known when the director and the whole process of the film and all of its elements address this thing. In that sense, good film is intrinsically or inherently opposed to this capitalist logic.
Yeah.
Right? Now, for those of you that are not familiar with the Lacanian critique of capitalism, I think we could call it that.
Yeah.
This famously comes about in his analysis of group psychology, or like Freud's social writings, which occurs in the late 60s as he is barred from the mainstream psychoanalytic institution, and as we have the countercultural revolution, anti-capitalist revolution in Paris, 68. He develops the theory of the discourses, for which there are 4 primary discourses. The discourse of the master, the discourse of the university, the discourse of the analyst, and the discourse of, what am I missing? Master, university,
hysterics discourse,
analysts, and the discourse of the hysteric.
Yeah.
So now, again, let's just take a step back. With Paris Levitas and others, I have done a lot of intro videos on the theory of the 4 discourses, so we don't need to and even with Stephanie Swales, I asked her about the discourse theory, and I brought out the math themes and I put them on the screen as I often do. Because I think, like you, Helen, I'm very much of the view that the kind of generation that we find ourselves in, highly influenced by Lacanian thought, we're at a stage now where I think that the communication of the Lacanian conceptual apparatus has reached a level of clarity and application. And I think it's very evident in the way that you write, where you have sort of absorbed these concepts and you are then therefore capable of articulating them very well. So that's just a proviso to say we don't need to explain the 4 discourses, but let me ask you to elaborate further on this capitalist discourse, which is the 5th discourse. It's not a part of the 4. And I think that in a way you argue, that that's what most cinema is subordinated to, right? In a certain way. And it is utopian. I love the way that you use that in a kind of counterintuitive way. Explain that utopian element. And then drive into this question of universal lack, which seems to be really the heart of the theory of kind of what's emancipatory here.
Yeah, it's interesting. So maybe I haven't really thought about this, but this just sort of came to mind, that maybe what Slavoj was getting at with the perversion in film is something to do with the master's discourse in a way. Because I think there is a slight, like what I've noticed because I used to spend a lot of time in America and working with Americans. And I think that the American film industry, because of the way that the economy is structured still, compared to what has happened in Europe, and there are similarities, but some differences, that the European film industry is more in this university discourse space. And that there is a greater honesty to potentially this like master's discourse or capitalist discourse, and you can actually sort of see it. Whereas the university discourse is basically the master's discourse in disguise. So yeah, this question of universal lack relative to utopia and the utopia of capitalism. So, one of the things that is lost in our order of capitalism is precisely as we develop philosophically as humans, throughout history, and we come to understand things, these critiques sort of the cutting both ways of a critique ends up being contorted by the economic conditions we are in. So I guess that is just a way to sort of say that I'm not let's say bemoaning the fall of religion. I think it's but there is something in an atheism that exists today that misses an aspect of religious thinking, which is theology, which is important to tarry with relative to our religiosity today, which is a mystified religiosity claiming to be atheist. So you have, religions of all kinds, which, let's say, attempt to manage questions of lack and excess in subjectivity. We have, Nietzsche writing in The Gay Science about, the Buddha has died, but his shadow is cast on the cave wall for 1,000 years. And, people like Tad DeLay have done really good work on this, and Peter Rollins, but questions of, God is unconscious. So the God issue persists because of the structure of our subjectivity. And this is because of the way in which we lack on an ontological level as subjects, and the discomfort that arises from this question of lack, that we emerge from less than nothing. This anxiety producing truth, which points to the actual reality of our world and just how far away we are from living in, let's say, appropriate ways with that information. This is extremely anxiety producing. And so it is comforting to paper over that lack with promises that we can evacuate that lack, that it's contingent, not ontological. And this promise of wholeness, completeness, is the fuel by which capitalism sustains itself in, let's say, bad faith ways. So it is a logic of, the spurious infinite, bad infinity in terms of Hegel, where we promise ourselves a horizon that never comes. So, whilst we may have had heaven or promises of heaven to excuse material conditions in reality, it's just passing now, but we'll have heaven. This heaven question has come down to earth, but instead of us experiencing like a divided heaven in the shared experience of living on this miraculous rock with all these different people and acting accordingly and creating a sort of an equitable society, we create utopic visions that are impossible. And one of the results of this is, talked about a lot of people like Girard in terms of the scapegoat theory and Levi-Strauss and stuff, but we have to create enemies. We have a problem solution logic, and we have to create enemies behind whom, cast in their shadow, this perfect world exists, which it doesn't, it can't, because everything's divided. So cinema, again, at its most powerful, can remind us of the ontological reality of lack, not only just in, substance as subject, not only just as subjects. So we experience this at the level of our subjectivity as human speaking subjects, but in reality, all reality.
Mhm.
And yeah, so in film, this would be to do with the way, like in the clinic, the analyst mobilizes the desire of the analysand to experience a reprieve, a solution to their suffering.
Mhm.
And this is again cutting both ways, that the suffering also is real.
Yeah.
The suffering may reduce as a result of tarrying with the underlying conditions
Mhm.
of suffering and the attempts to repress the truth of the reality that leads to the suffering. But yeah, this is, but acknowledging this is terrifying. And every day that goes past, more terrifying, because the more we deny it, our not only experiences, but the reality is, and reality is for different groups and individuals worse than others, precisely because of the way that capitalism ends up stratifying.
Yeah.
Requires exploitation, subjugation, all this kind of stuff. So I think this is one thing that I kind of want to make clear. It's not, one of the ways that I would say, like, often a university discourse critique of this universal land comes about, and it actually arrests a potential, let's say, revolution in libido, neutering it while sounding sort of like radical, is to be like, well, this doesn't acknowledge this, or universal, well, men have it better than women, blah, blah, blah. But we're talking about here the question of like fantasy ideology, excess, lack, which affects material conditions and vice versa.
Mhm.
And it is absolutely true. I think we've reached peak woke, or whatever we want to call it, peak university discourse. But I think there's going to be new ways in which this is done, where a promise of emancipation becomes the very mechanism by which we cannot emancipate ourselves. But
Okay. Yeah, this is very interesting. So in a way, the auteur, the director, the kind of authority, the authority of the cinematic other who is leading us along, because I mean, it's very interesting, by the way, like in a certain way, going back to my example of like bad films that can be good,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right? Or like not cathartic, but
yeah,
like pleasurable,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Right? There's that element. There's another element of films that touch a zeitgeist
yeah,
unintentionally.
yeah, yeah,
Say
exactly.
like Jaws, or
Yeah,
like Spielberg, or like Alien, right? Like
yeah,
these kind of like paradigm representational films. So like we analyze them at the level of like cultural representation.
mhm,
But what you seem to be talking about is a kind of different level of non-conceptual, subjective engagement with film that is identifiable vis-a-vis this kind of operation that it does on our subjectivity.
yeah,
And that's different than what you say, this kind of conceptual form of the authority of the auteur kind of making an ideological point,
yeah,
right? Because an ideological point unto itself
mhm,
often can fall flat and not work out, or it can be like anachronistic. It can be caught up within a sort of bad politics, a kind of liberal politics, right? Or a kind of
yeah,
speaking to a very precise moment, and then 5 years later it's no longer relevant, for
yeah,
example,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
We see that a lot with so-called political films,
yeah,
right? Where their shelf life of relevance is ultimately a reflection of like the Democratic Party's talking points at a very particular moment,
yeah.
right? Even though they've been given millions of dollars and the whole apparatus tells us it's so political, it's so political. You know what I mean? So like you're kind of opposed to this idea of like the authority of film comes from ideology.
Yeah.
You're not really or from like
Oh, yeah, it's interesting because I think all of the things like the whole history of film relative to ideology
Yeah.
operates on us as well. So, you know, there's things like the fact of the star system, the fact of these, you know, autos, these are things that sort of help it work sometimes. But I actually, yeah, I'm more thinking about it as a machine,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
interesting because I had the sense that, like, for me as a very, like, politicized subject for,
Yeah.
like, my own various reasons that I've written about and talked about and so on, I don't need to get into. I've always felt like initially my interest in the avant-garde that,
Yeah.
like, you know, in the 60s and for example, or sort of like French cinema, you know, things, those interests were ideological and political,
Yeah.
you know?
Mhm.
And, like Pasolini, you know, like I'm
Yeah.
engaging here because there's a profound, I don't know, Maoist
Yeah.
thesis that I want to integrate into my understanding of Marxism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Seems to me that this is so dead today.
Hmm.
This political potential of film.
Yeah.
Where does the
Yeah.
political potential of film live? Does it live in some nostalgia for the
Mm.
avant-garde?
Yeah.
Or does it live on the periphery of
Yeah.
these kind of underfunded
Yeah.
marginal projects, you know?
Yes.
Like, where does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
where is politics in contemporary cinema?
Possible then, precisely because we live in a much more capitalist, much more commoditized world than even in the 60s. We have, through the internet, through social media, all social relations. I mean, you know, we can say this, it was pure capitalism already, but it's even worse, you know. But I think, you know, I'm not saying that I'm doing a good job because I'm not. You know, I try to do this, and I think the reason why I ended up for, you know, I don't want to be too biographical, like you said, but like it was precisely being shut out of more normal spaces for literally kind of contingent weird reasons that then I had this separate interest in theory and was making connections and realized I could actually, you know, for me making films is like an illness that, you know, I have to sort of, as in my addiction or whatever. It's also, you know, my reason to exist, even though who cares, you know, nobody really watches my stuff. But anyway, but it obviously films are there to be watched. We have this question of, oh, the internet, you can put it up, blah, 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 blah. We know how bollocks this all is in terms of like platform capitalism, prosumer. It actually just completely dilutes everything and it's fucking nonsense. But in terms of the ways in which films are financed and whether it is at all possible, I sometimes you watch things. So 2017 was an amazing year for film. But that was 9 years ago. And those films were being developed maybe even 20 years ago, you know. And things are really dire. I think social media, in terms of how we understand ourselves relative to the other, is awful. I think politics is awful. And literally, it's not even a question of a conscious thing. You can have the most brilliant piece of work, and even I've, you know, thought of things like, you know, you really you do all the buzzwords and then you get this in and just like you really hide it. But the cinema industrial complex, the festival industrial, which I maybe should do a whole book on the festival industrial complex and this competition model and the abject exploitation, you know. These films, precisely by the professionals in this sphere, cannot be. It's the bourgeois logic. It's bourgeois socialism. It's like literally you can't understand it, and it's just like abort, abort, abort. Put it in the bin, and you can have like the most beautiful piece of work. But you know, sometimes things happen by accident. Like I believe in miracles. Miracles do happen. Like Quentin Mercy writes about this, you know, it is like accidents happen. And I think there was a miraculous film made in 2021, was it 2021? Pig, starring Nicolas Cage. And I think partly because they chose to cast Nicolas Cage, they brought with it this whole universe of the transferential experience of the viewer when what they expect to see when they watch a Nicolas Cage movie. And it completely subverts the genre of this sort of thriller revenge movie, and it's brilliant. So, you know, I believe that something can happen, you know, randomness occurs, whatever. There's contradiction that is productive. But in general, and as the scope of like capitalist ideology and the bourgeoisification of all ideology, you know, spreads, and this sort of management of the arts, I mean, I guess, you know, it's like this question of like having children. I've just had a baby, so obviously I'm not that, let's say, pessimistic about the future. So I still make films, you know, but I guess I get a lot out of this, the whole process anyway. So, you know, the result and whether it gets, you know, viewed and shared or whatever, that's a nice bonus. But of course, my father calls this whole thing the funding industrial complex in Europe, the self-licking lollipop, and obviously like distribution is the same kind of thing, because, you know, does the film exist, or the sort of powers that be, you know, funding from day one basically determines the film's future, and often, you know, films that sort of squeeze in, that appear to be radical, or let's say to not apply to this like bourgeois liberal logic, be that a sort of conservative, more explicitly conservative, or a sort of like liberal glossed conservative aesthetic, you know, I often find myself watching it a couple of times and being like, oh, unfortunately, yes. Also, I mean, there's questions even of things like, can you do film criticism or art criticism anymore in a world where we are all so precarious? So the, let's say, the proletarianization of everybody, you know, working in institutions or not, you know, where one's job relies on bearing the message of the publication to, you know, that pays one's salary, and what capitalism does. I mean, I went to a talk by Ben Burgess recently, who articulated this so well in terms of what is so awful about capitalism is it really is like, you die, you know, you don't have your job, you die, you know, it's we have a sort of contortion of that whole thing as well.
Yeah. Are you kind of suggesting that do we have a kind of loss of a monoculture, such that great pieces of cinematic production, is there still the capability or the capacity for pieces of cinema to touch a kind of zeitgeist, a kind of cultural moment, a type of expression of the totality, not the totality of the plot, not the totality of intrinsic to the film, but the totality of our sociality? Are you saying that that is also dissipated? Say, I don't know, like the new Avatar or these new, you know, like, is there something lost at that level, putting aside the question of the kind of intrinsic left-wing evacuation of truly political ideological films, if that ever did exist? That's a question. But have we also lost something there in this internet age?
Yeah, everything is always a cultural artifact, you know, so it is true. And sometimes I think some of the worst films can be the most illuminating in terms of what they say about culture if they're read in a certain way. And I certainly think it is possible. But often, you know, the makers are so consciously, this is also not a moral question, by the way, about the makers. We are all forced to participate in capitalism in a certain way. And often when we think we are choosing, you know, this is our desire mediated and enforced by material conditions. So, you know, we think we're doing something radical and exposing, you know, did you know this? But actually, in fact, the exposure itself may be the revelation of, you know, maybe doing the opposite. So let me think of an example. I can think of many examples, but some that I like the people involved, so I don't want to. This is the thing, I've got lots of friends making films, and also I participated in stuff that I don't agree with, whatever. But, you know, I think Don't Look Up as an example, or a really interesting example was, did you see the film The Hunt that came out during Trump's first presidency?
No.
It's really brilliant. It's basically, it's a film about liberals hunting deplorables for sport.
Huh.
And basically, so Trump got it banned, which is why nobody saw it. But he got it banned precisely because it was one of these radical films. So he consciously was like, oh, this is awful. It's so offensive. It's showing, liberals hunting the likes of us because this is offensive. In fact, it actually, what it did was it exposed this narrative of that Trump had, that everybody in Hollywood was this awful cultural elite who had these certain values. It was actually poking fun at this. So, or something like Don't Look Up, which again, you tend to have this kind of perfectionistic or us versus them, we're the good guys, but maybe actually it is precisely this puritanical oppositional logic that is part of the problem, and the commoditization of social relations in that way, the more like, the commoditization of morals, the performativity of, sort your Coke cans out, blah, 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 blah. You just want to discipline yourself into having the right views. And that's really, the Jaws moment is exposing that rather than, so sometimes, I was going to say, it's made me think about something, but yeah.
I was thinking, just as an example, would be like the work of Jordan Peele.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Whereby, like, what is his film? Us.
Yeah.
Right. It's a very interesting film in the sense of it's sort of so metaphorically and symbolically rich.
Yeah.
In terms of a theory of bourgeois proletariat social relations.
Wow. Yeah.
What it stages is the kind of crisis of the Black middle class in America.
Okay. Interesting.
And they have these kind of underground proletarian doubles beneath the surface that are like their murderous others or something. It's just a very kind of open film for like all kinds of allegorical, because I feel like Spielberg, unbeknownst to himself, is like a master of allegory. Like, for example, like E.T. Is really a film about the Oedipus complex. It's really a kind of allegory of Oedipus. And then it turns out that like 9 out of 10 Spielberg films are the same question of like the absent father, the divorce epidemic of the 90s. Is this kind of imminent commentary on like, so one of the things that interests me about film is like this kind of imminent sociological commentary about the kind of changing class valences of contemporary capitalism, and this idea of speaking to certain class elements and their ideological assumptions, and then the capacity of the film to upset that is very powerful, like Peele's Us upsets that kind of. So that's like an intrinsic thing, which is not necessarily always intentional on behalf of the director to upset that. Sometimes they can kind of make a political error, which is actually emancipatory.
Absolutely.
Right. So that interests me. I think it's interesting because maybe one thing you were saying about the pressures of the kind of, and the corruption of the contemporary Hollywood cinema scene and its situation means that there's a total evacuation, perhaps even of these accidental emancipatory messages, because everything is so much more controlled. It's like kind of what Anton Jäger calls hyperpolitics.
Absolutely.
Right. And so like, in the old welfare state, you had these like Hollywood productions that like are so rich in allegory, so rich in symbolism. We can actually then chop them up and say that Jaws is really a metaphor of the phallic fear of communism.
Exactly.
Can we still read films like that?
Do you know,
like Zizek's model? It's like every film is like a reservoir of allegorical symbolism. You seem to be saying you agree with that, but you also are adding another layer, which again I'm interpreting vis-a-vis this discourse of the analyst. That's something different than that too. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
And I love doing, analyzing society through the lens of its cultural products. I just love this, and also there is something about, if we talk about like the 19th century novel, by the way, I actually went to this amazing presentation by one of my husband's friends the other day, who's an academic in Amsterdam, writing about the metaphor of money, or not even the metaphor, the presence of actual money in the 19th century novel, and what this tells us about capitalist relations, and how, in some ways, we can't do the same analysis now because the understanding of how capitalism operated was so raw and exposing at that time that in terms of its mystification today. But I had a couple of points. Firstly, just in terms of like the Jordan Peele thing, I think it's interesting because, you know, occasionally in recent years, I can think of some films that do really good exposure, metaphorically, literally, and in the right direction, not despite itself. But it's often, let's say, with permission, so with ideological permission. So it might be from a filmmaker who is long-standing enough that they've earned their stripes, or it, you know, I think of people like Pedro Almodovar in Spain, you know, where his stuff would not get through the ways in which films are funded in Europe today. Spain is an interesting example because I think it has quite an interesting economic organization compared to certainly the part of Europe that I'm from. But, you know, a film like Parasite, but there is this Orientalism in terms of career as a signifier, and, you know, this guy gets to say it, but not us. You know, it's Zizek's joke about in the synagogue, you know, with the rabbi and
right.
Well, I'm not, you know.
No, I love that. Well, but by the way, I do want to, I don't know, acknowledge that the fact Parasite was elected and celebrated was very interesting because it revealed to me a kind of the same way the liberals related to Bernie Sanders, like, fuck, we can't ignore this. It's like, you know, it's like this antagonism that's like, shit, like, yes, we have to acknowledge this because of its excellence. But its excellence was so undeniably political that, it couldn't have been made in America, probably
not, no.
Right.
And it's interesting because I do think that there is this sort of genre of rich critique, White Lotus, Succession, Triangle of Sadness, which, you know, I find enjoyable, but I don't think are really, let's say, like Marxist, and,
like new class war films, kind of new,
And they tend to be kind of
populist,
fetishistic, and oppositional and puritanical and Orientalist and all this kind of stuff, but also very fun to watch. So
sure.
And well done in their own way. But I've now we were talking about Parasite.
Well, that Oh, I guess my question was on this question of like social allegory and film, and you know, because I was just saying, like, the model you're giving us, because it's in opposition to this authority of the university discourse and its ideology. Again, I'm just trying to pinpoint that distinction, which I think is so original about your argument, that you're sort of not saying that ideology is dead or that it doesn't matter, but that the brilliance of cinema is discovered kind of other than that or elsewhere from that.
And this is the thing.
I'm returning to that theme.
Like say, like the critique I would have about that Laura Mulvey essay is not that I don't think that it's relevant to make those statements and critique. It's just that it's said in the name of Lacan, and I don't think it's Lacanian. I think it's Foucauldian, which means we've just lost this whole other part of film theory, which I think is, you know, really productive. But I was just to go back to the 19th century. You know, there is this idea. I think it was like Stendhal who says like a novel should be like a mirror walking along the side of a road, and you know, film obviously by its nature, it's visual. Desire plays out in the visual field. Like it's like it is holding a mirror up, a distorted one, an idea, you know, whatever. So it of course exposes something despite itself, you know. And this is also, you know, a real thing about psychoanalysis, and this is where I prefer psychoanalysis in its kind of seeing what's there, you know, rather than like this, you know, detective story ideology of like the hidden truth. There's a, you know, it's very conspiracy theory. Like I'm not a conspiracy, you know, I find conspiracy theories fun and funny or whatever. And I think we live in a real conspiracy theory age for various reasons that are really understandable. But it's actually all there, guys, you know.
So it's kind of interesting. So it's like two forms of realism, maybe. like
Yeah.
there's kind of like this ideological university discourse version of conceptual realism, where the approach is to sort of play with existing representations of social reality. And of course, in a Hollywood that's intrinsically hampered
Mhm.
by all of these sort of political lobbying and sort of like sort of sociological conceptions of group identity, that it's like you feel as if you're being toyed with, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
You're being like, right, like every action film, you're being messed with, right? And the construction and the choice of a certain protagonist is meant to appeal to this identity group and not this one. And then we want to put this group in opposition to this group because that will help the Democrats in 2
Yeah.
years, right? Right?
Yeah.
That's what they do, right?
Yeah.
And that's why these films are so dead after 5 years, because it turns out it was a political film
Yeah.
for the liberals in a very particular moment,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Um, I
It's
wanna
like,
I wanna I wanna read a quote from your book that I found very nice. You say, "Art's power over subjectivity resides in its ability to house contradiction within its structure and to operate on unconsciousness.
mhm,
What is perhaps unique about the art form of film is its ambition to totalize.
yeah.
Whilst structured storylines corral lack within film toward a potentially productive point of revelation as to the true nature of desire, films that attempt to repress contradiction are altogether propagandistic."
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does that mean, to repress contradiction
Yeah. Okay. So,
and propaganda? That's a very interesting point.
so I guess, you know, something, you have the likes of, there's loads of people involved in the political sphere who hate French theory, right? Who hate, what was it, like Chomsky hates Slavoj or whatever, and lots of people we can think of. But the thing is, and we can say, that let's say secondary, tertiary, university, I'll choose it again, but not to be cliche about it, but when Jordan Peterson talks about cultural Marxism, what he's talking about is actually, I would say, a cultural feature of conservatism, i.e., his own side. Like, it's not Marxism. Sorry, but basically, yeah.
I know, as a side point, it's so, hold your thought, but it's so funny because the cultural Marxism conspiracy comes from the Frankfurt School,
Yeah, yeah,
but the Frankfurt School philosophers were all cultural conservatives. They
yeah,
were. Look at Horkheimer's book on the family. Come on,
yeah.
come
No,
on. It's
I,
a total distortion. Like, it's a
yeah,
complete obfuscation of reality.
no,
But
I
go on.
agree with you. Like, these signify, it's just like I'm always sort of like, yeah. I mean, I guess I wish I was braver, because I'm such a sort of, maybe it's the way I was brought up, but like people pleaser. But I'm always like, it's the sniff sniff precise opposite, like that guy's the person who calls himself, they're the conservative. Anyway, so what were we saying? Yeah, but basically it's to do with the way in which desire is mobilized in the 20th century because of, I would say, the collapsing rate of profit and countervailing tendencies and this necessity to mine profit and to commoditize everything, including subjectivity and desire itself. So we need a way to analyze subjectivity relative to capitalism. This is not some woo-woo mystification. The woo-woo mystification is taking a version of this that isn't grounded in material reality. But I think that the analytic approach to subjectivity is profoundly materialist. So yeah, I can't remember what the question was, but basically, this is all a really important stuff. Like the French theory is important once capitalism has this turn towards mobilizing subjectivity in a certain way. This de-theologizing, it's like a re-theologizing of a collapse in religion, basically, where religion. Oh yeah, it was to do with repression, the question of repression, right? So basically, I don't think personally. Okay, we can talk about the time when Freud was writing. What does repression mean? And what does repression mean today?
Mm.
So obviously Freud is approaching sexuality in a way that's novel and important, and is talking about repression that let's say at this time is manifesting in a certain way relative to the messiness of sex and what sex is.
Mm-hmm.
But in a sense, sex is to do with this sort of return of the repressed of contradiction itself. And repression is less to do with sex and more to do with the intolerance of contradiction. Basically, it's repressing contradiction, which resides in a really profound way in sex. So propaganda, let's say, in this like apolitical, if politics is tarrying with contradiction, which manifests itself in all, the not all of the divided, the collective of all divided subjects who share what they don't share, which is lack itself. And as soon as you have two or more people in one space, it's political, because we have, precisely because of lack, varying desires that sometimes look the same because of material reality, which informs desire. So we desire in similar ways because we are born practically in similar ways, and we are in a order of society that structures society in a certain way or whatever. But we have the potential to go any direction with our desire. So there's always competing desires. And because of this fracture or primary lack, there is a possibility for a kind of quantum derailment via desire, which basically allows for, which in capitalism manifests as like one person getting all the money. Sort of thing. That's like a long calculation. But yeah, so it's really the denial of lack or contradiction that is propagandistic and that is utopic in this capitalist way. So whether you're doing it in this righteousness, convinced of one's own, the problems of capitalism are contingent, it's to do with representation, it's to do with fiddling with the numbers, it's to do with whatever. This is highly apolitical and highly, well, if we're taking political in this sort of like, let's say, ideal version of what politics could be. And I think also we have this return repress and politics reform in UK and MAGA in America, which is like the reaction to this purity, but it's obviously horrendous and maybe way worse than I thought it was going to be. When I was living in America in 2016, and it's worse now. Anyway,
no, it's very interesting, Helen, because I just wrote a preface to a Indian Marxist scholar who wrote a book that was critical of Zizek, particularly on Israel-Palestine.
Right.
And I was very convinced of his argument, even though, a complicated relationship with Zizek. I studied with him, and you have to adore aspects of his work, but he's also kind of like a mentor to me. Yeah. But over the years, as my Marxism has kind of grown and matured, I've found that the kind of left Lacanian conception of capitalist subjectivity is extraordinarily plausible, as a type of universal theory of subjectivity.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, there are challenges that I have with it, insofar as sometimes the political prescriptions that can be derived from them will lead to conclusions such as, oh yes, well, two conflicting parties, the sort of tactic we must bring, say, between Israel and Hamas, is that both parties must kind of recognize the universal lack that they've disavowed. And if that recognition, so you see what can be a problem, is that it sneaks back in a type of recognition politics on the basis of a universalism of shared lack.
Yeah.
So I affirm the kind of plausibility of the ontological presentation of subjectivity.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of challenges. Now, of course, some ways this is processed on the left is the debate between like the Deleuze and the left Lacanians.
Yeah.
It would be useful for us to gather your thoughts, if you have any, on Deleuze's cinema books, because of course, Deleuzians find in the Lacanian emphasis of lack, well, I guess they find in some problem, some kind of authoritarian. I think their arguments are false or kind of misleading, but I also find them highly specific to like the French political scene of the late 60s and not quite relevant today. But there are aspects of Deleuze's cinema book that I find quite interesting, even though he's working with different philosophers like Bergson.
Yeah.
Do you find anything in, so I guess that's my little criticism of the Lacanian politics.
Yes.
It's kind of like, affirm this, but I
Yeah.
question that.
Yeah.
But Deleuze also has this idea that cinema can invent a people. He has this concept of fabulation, third world cinema. There's been some interesting things done there. You know, I don't know, like, you know, he has some interesting things to say in his whole kind of analysis by director. He has kind of like always
Yeah.
interesting things to say. I slightly disagree with some of the things he says. Like, for example, my favorite film director, just to put my cards on the table, is the American film director John Cassavetes.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, maybe we could talk about him towards the conclusion of our conversation, just to
Yeah.
separate. So, three things.
Yeah.
Lacanian politics and its shortcomings. Second is Deleuze in cinema. Do you like it? Is there
Yeah.
anything cool in there,
Mhm.
useful in there, or is it kind of bunk for you? And then third, we'll get to, because I want to ask you who your favorite director is.
It is interesting. So firstly, this question of like the political, yeah, and I see a lot of fragmentation that has taken place since, let's say, October 2023, relative to the left and Lacanians and things like this.
But also to the professional class within cinema, because all of the lefties within the professional world
Yeah.
have been subsequently ostracized, I would say.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting. I potentially have like a lot to say, but yeah, where to start? So yeah, I mean the thing is, I one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is how this question of lack, I say no t-shirt, has like come to dominate the Lacanian sphere. When I'm kind of thinking like if I were to do another book, I might write about excess, because that's really what we're dealing with in terms of, you know, what has been going on in Gaza. And this is sort of like a kind of different thing. And when it's very real and playing out, it's not just so relevant to just say lack. I also, you know, I don't sound like it, but I'm from Northern Ireland. And so we have had our own history with this identity political question. And I was actually asked to go on this podcast, like it was really at the start of things. And I sort of felt like what I have to say about Northern Ireland is so different to what's going on here, because this is actually a very, you know, there's a story I told. I mean, I don't actually want to go. Okay, if you're interested in the story, I don't know which podcast I told you, but I have this idea about politics in terms of this question of, it sounds really trite, but act accordingly. Act accordingly was this thing that I was on the school trip and we had this really weird science teacher who took us on the school trip, and there was like a big accident that happened, and she just told us to act accordingly. Should I tell you the story? I mean,
please. I didn't know you have Irish roots. Are you related to Peter?
Yeah.
You're kidding me.
Yeah, distantly related, but yeah, we are from the same stock in North.
That's incredible.
Yeah, Northern Ireland is an interesting place that produces. I think, especially, I'm 16, I think years younger, 15, 16 years younger than Pete. So the Gen X, he's Gen X. I'm more like mid-range millennial, but I feel like the Gen X kids coming out of Northern Ireland have done quite interesting, you know, and I'm very influenced by Pete. But weirdly, we didn't meet until he was 42 and I was 26. And I actually stumbled across one of his books and I was like, oh, hang on, what? This guy is interesting. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so yeah, excess, Northern Ireland. Oh yeah.
The way to understand the kind of genocide in Gaza is not through this kind of, you know, universalism of the recognition of our overlapping lacks, but rather through excess as a concept. Yeah.
Getting, you know, facing what people have faced. This is not a question of philosophizing about the structure of subjectivity or whatever. You know, this is a sort of different question at this precise moment. And excess, let's say because of lack plays out in certain ways, and it's not enough to just be like blah blah lack. These are things that have to be dealt with, and in a sense, something that I feel like psychoanalysis can do, precisely because of its understanding of lack, can help us act on reality in more appropriate ways. It can free us up to actually see things for what they are, potentially. But yeah, it's not enough to. This is not a one-way street. Sorry, a two-way street or whatever.
Right. There's a kind of asymmetry that there's a power. There's a
Yeah.
power dynamic that I think in some of the Lacanian theorizations could be overlooked.
Yeah.
Without, because you have the Foucauldian theory of power, which its problem is power is theorized in like ubiquity. It's like ubiquitous, it's inescapable.
Yeah.
One could criticize the left Lacanian concept of like, okay, well, where is power? Yeah,
absolutely. And this is absolutely, I mean, like, something that my own analysis helped me do was really to think about my life economically, and acknowledge where the power dynamics that had operated in my life that I was in denial of existed, and they were real. Often in psychoanalysis, it's not just, oh, you thought it was this, it was that. Often it is really that. Like, no, you are correct. It really is actually this, because I think this is something that, and again, like, I don't want to be like, obviously I have such a criticism of like bourgeois socialism and like not left, like liberal wokery or whatever. But I don't want, this is not to say that the opposite is also, and potentially worse. It's what this question of subjectivity shows us is subjectivity and potentially reality is structured in a certain way, and this results in as I say, excess, which plays out in capitalism in a certain way. But what we do with that information once we have it is you still have to act upon it. It's not enough to just be like, that's it. But then, what sometimes happens, and I think, there is sometimes this third worldism, which it's true, there's an Orientalism, and et cetera, which in different circumstances, can lead to different issues. But I think it's precisely when we're not being Orientalist and we recognize, let's say, the humanity of the other who is being oppressed as a human who, precisely because they lack as well, is actually a real human being who is actually experiencing in reality what is going on. So I guess, it's not a this or that in terms of, let's say, bourgeois socialism and left Lacanianism. It's like left Lacanianism allows us to understand the structure of reality and subjectivity, which, because of this split, generates a quantum potentiality, which in society results in excess, let's say, as you say, asymmetric systems of power. And I think the thing is, it's like, in terms of what I see economically is the big issue today, which is capital mobility, collapsing rate of profit, and the countervailing tendencies. I think we can so get caught up in a reading of Marx, which exposes, let's say, it's Communist Manifesto, Volume 1, whereas actually Volume 3 really tells us a lot about what's going on today. And we can get arrested in critiques that don't take on board what we're dealing with today, which, let's say, a country that I'm from, although this question of national identity is an interesting one in Ireland, is playing the role of, let's say, the facilitator of tech utopic tax evasion, which is affecting everybody in awful ways. And sometimes people on the left don't see it because they are comforted by a, let's say, heartwarming version of analysis that has been really relevant, but yeah, the thing is, it's like, it's sort of do with it what you will, you know, as in lack exists. This plays out in reality. And when you're in reality, you have to do something about reality.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Helen, because I've always had the premonition that in Lacan's critique of capitalism, which is implicit,
Mhm.
even though we're not going to fall into that vulgar kind of humanist reading of Lacan, where we say, oh, well, Lacan was a liberal conservative, so therefore he has no critique of capitalism.
Yeah,
We're not going to say that. So please don't think that. That's not how we're reading him conceptually. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But I've always had the sense that perhaps one of the missing elements of Lacanian critique of capitalism is the problem of domination,
Yeah, yeah.
in the sense that, yeah, like the tax evasion of the Irish system
Hmm.
is an example of this fetishistic invisibility of domination
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and the kind of totality of the system whereby it kind of participates but permits the subjects within it to disavow that participation in it,
yeah,
and
yeah.
also not to see its pernicious effects
Hmm.
as they are lived subjectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, right. And that's the horror of the system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does Lacan's conception of the capitalist discourse help us think domination? I'm not so sure. I don't know if what you think. It
Mm.
is interesting, though, that you share your example for yourself, that analysis helped you facilitate a kind of greater clarity about material dynamics as they determine your own subjectivity.
Mhm.
I can say that it's true for me as well, insofar as what analysis allowed me to see was the kind of missing social dimension to certain moments of my life that were very formative. It
Yeah,
helped me see them in their social,
yeah,
um, the relationalities became more clear, and if that, in a sense, that's maybe the intrinsic subversive power of psychoanalysis, is that it allows us to see those interrelations
yeah, yeah,
more up close, you know?
yeah.
And so does cinema, therefore. But Deleuze, we didn't get your take on that.
I'm not like, I cannot claim to be a massive expert.
Sure.
Obviously, there's a sort of like D&G versus Lacan, ha ha.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, forget that, yeah.
but I think we were saying before, you know, and you know, it was quite funny when somebody, this is like, I just hate the online world, but it gives you just enough to like grist or like lubricate the wheel of your remaining, including like reconnect with friends and all this, you know, blah blah. But anyway, somebody had read like the introduction of my book that I think was available on Amazon for free, and he did a little summary on his Instagram page, and some guy in the comments was like, "Fuck these Foucauldian academic feminists," blah 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 blah. And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, the book is basically a critique of that." But anyway, I used to in the past, I used to always like participate and try to convince people. And sometimes it worked, but I just don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that. But, you know, having said that, there's lots of Foucault I do like. So maybe I am a rabid Foucauldian feminist, academic. But, you know, there is lots to be appreciated in Foucault. And I was going to actually just make a critique earlier about like Sartre relative to Frantz Fanon, because I sometimes think like if you read Fanon without the Sartrean introduction, it's better, you know.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Well, who's it? No. Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you like Cassavetes? It's my own person. This is now we're moving into very idiosyncratic territory. My final comments.
And one of the ways I really like him is he's obviously got the sickness, and he just makes stuff himself. And I you know, so we're talking about like are films possible? Sometimes like the way the economy changes, you were talking about the 1970s, moments occur where there's a little trickle of money in the direction of people making a certain type of work, and this allows for things to happen at contingent moments. Not to be, you know, what's that book by Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers?
Right.
Like a really dodgy version of like, obviously what comes out of it is the 10,000 hours, but he does talk about like, you know, the conditions, like what there's people making the garment workers industry in the 1920s in New York, and these like certain contingent features, but let's say economic features. But he, you know, he would make movies, and then he would use his own money to make his own movies, and some of them are really brilliant. You know, what I watched fairly recently? I can't remember. Damn. But yeah, no, really good, really good. I love it. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it as well. I guess, I mean, there's certain like recurring motifs in Cassavetes that I very much like, especially this question of hysteria.
Yeah, yeah,
Is,
yeah.
is very central to his work, but also there's this like strong political fight that he has with the ideological hegemony of Hollywood, that is very profound. There's a kind of, I don't know, methodological anti-hierarchy,
Yeah.
given that he, like the way that he structures his actors, and
Yeah, yeah,
he brings non-professionals in and introduces some kind of like new way of method acting that's like never been done before in a weird way. And Jenna Rollins becomes this kind of profound muse.
Yeah.
In the same way that like David Lynch had that one female actress that he always used.
Yeah.
Forget her name, in all of his films. Right. And so she becomes this kind of like conduit.
Yeah.
Right. To some like expression that's very profound.
Yeah.
Are you a Lynchian fan as well, or is this like?
Because I do really love Lynch, and I really admire. Obviously, it was interesting to me, talking about like, you know, cultural moments and what they say about society. It was interesting how, when he died, the outpouring was immense. You know, he was really important for a lot of people, which is interesting. I don't know what that says, but it was really a moment of like, whoa, okay. Lots of people who I thought were sort of squares, you know, turns out we're like,
No,
really.
totally. No, I see this all the time, like Tom Waits.
Yeah.
You know, Tom Waits, who is this avant-garde, experimental, weird, marginal figure for years.
Yeah, yeah.
But then like all of a sudden, oh yeah, I've always loved. I'm like, no, you didn't always love Tom Waits. Don't lie to me. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an interesting phenomenon. And there's so much fetishistic logics in the cinema industry that I'd love to, maybe in a future conversation, learn more about, where it's like this kind of representational logic of liberalism that, you know, the work that's done around fetishizing and celebrating the auteur, or the one, or this kind of cult of the bourgeois individual, right? This, I mean, that must be so demoralizing for people in the cinema world. It's because it's so anti-egalitarian. Not to say that egalitarianism is possible in capitalism, but like, it's so, I mean, there's more hierarchy on a film set than in any church.
Yeah. Yeah.
By far. It's actually one of the reasons, anecdotally, I really don't like working with film. It's just so rigid, and so its own theory of genius is so flawed. It's so arcane in a
So
certain way.
it's the awards season right now,
Yeah.
and it's amazing, you know, because we all, you know, we know it's bollocks. Well, okay, because obviously it's bollocks and it isn't. But the issue is, as we've mentioned, this word quantum. Everything is quantum. So it's like you have something that is 95% good and something that's 96% good, and the 96% good gets everything. The 95, no, but it's not just that. There's it's questions of exploitation and value. You know, how much free labor is garnered because of prestige and awards prestige, and like the fetishism of awards is crazy. But it's really hard to do that in a world where ideology, because of the repression of bourgeois relations in culture, the return is so obvious, you know. So it's like, oh, you know, and funny enough, often, very, very often, it's become a bit of a meme. Like, what wins best film is a few years later realized to be the most ideological
Right.
film, you know. if you look back at the best, you're like, seriously, we really did that. We really were up our own asses so much. We really thought this was the best thing. Like, what? It's just this affirmative of, the right think, and aren't we all such good, appropriate, moral people denying our like messy participation in the most, hideous, exploitative world,
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And so, um,
I was just going to say about the Lynch
yeah,
thing. One thing that I sort of, people say things, so I don't know how much he means it, but one of his sort of things that he talked about was like not explaining and not philosophizing about his work. And I actually sort of think kind of oppositely about that. Where
yeah,
I think
yeah,
films,
that's an interesting point. Yeah, he's insight meditation. So like I always call him like boomer new age wisdom, like this kind of,
yeah,
which always for me as a theoretician is so frustrating. This
yeah,
it's just like nothing worse. Like, but Slavoj does say that like, yeah, the logic of Lynch's theoretical apparatus is worth nothing.
there's nothing to do with his actual art.
It has nothing to do with his art. Yeah, yeah.
I think he actually doesn't know what he's talking about in terms of like
He doesn't know. Yeah, exactly.
it's like I think that precisely because art is and film is so infinitely generative, you can talk and talk and talk and never get to the heart of it anyway. It's the same as like psychoanalysis goes on and on and on and on and on. It doesn't matter. This is a Julia Kristeva thing. You remember, you forget. You remember, you forget. You have to keep talking. And this is the condition to be human, is to literally participate in this stuff and forget. And we have to keep reminding ourselves. I mean, I'm always like, whenever I give a talk, I'm like, can I do this? Do I know what I'm talking? Can I remember this? Because it slips through your fingers. You have to keep talking. And the good thing is you'll never get to the heart of it anyway. So philosophize away,
Yeah.
It's,
Now,
yeah.
are you still making a film on this evangelical American figure, the baker? Is this still
Yeah.
a project?
So this is long completed.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
So I've got something. I am making another one about another American religious figure who is different but related, but it's a very different project and a different insight, or whatever. So this is my friend's mum. My friend, it's Tammy Faye Baker.
Yeah.
Like, so fascinating. And originally, so it started developing an idea like 10 years ago, and the original idea was to call it an American contradiction. So how this woman, both her as a subjective figure, but also her life as it played out and the role she played in culture, was this radical encapsulation of contradiction, and how she straddled, basically commenting on how America fractures along these cultural divisive lines, and how Tammy was this like miraculous, almost. So the original joke was that she is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, uniting Jew and Gentile. But anyway, she's somebody who could bring, a conservative, religious fundamentalist and a trans activist together around the same table. Like, people love her. But so then was developing the idea, but didn't have the resources to do it. And it was actually at the time of this, there was a sort of a big gold rush in terms of streamers creating documentary miniseries, and it was taken on by a studio. I mean, I would have made it as this like small, independent, more like philosophical project, sort of playing out at the level of its form, the underlying argument, and the whole way of doing this in terms of like, wherever two or more people meet in my name, there I am, and different figures, blah blah blah. Anyway, and it was actually interestingly around that time, talking about like culture sort of speaking for itself. There was to be this Tammy Faye musical written by Elton John, and Jessica Chastain incarnated her and won an Oscar for it. So we really felt like there's this moment, maybe at this time of like peak pre-COVID, like cultural hatred, that this figure could. Anyway, so we had enough access or whatever for it to be taken on, and I worked as a writer producer on the project. And one of the ways in which, we're talking about the hierarchy, for these shows to get financed, you have all these sort of tick things, and one of them is to have a world-renowned, let's say Emmy, Oscar, or Golden Globe winning director. So I am demoted. Anyway, but we did make this miniseries, 4-part miniseries, and actually Elton John came on as an executive producer, blah blah blah. We hit completion at the point when, so the studio we were working with, Vice, went bust. This is actually because of Facebook. amongst other things, but it's mostly because of, you know, this also is just a comment about everybody gets proletarianized in capitalism.
Right.
It,
Right. I'm actually very happy I asked you about this.
yeah.
Yeah.
So then,
This is
but
amazing.
then, yeah, I don't know how. There's so much to say.
Right.
So much to say because I think.
So you completed. You're in post production. You completed.
It's finished. It's played at Sundance, whatever.
Oh,
But,
wonderful. Okay.
But okay, so there's the collapse of the studio. Which literally happened the week of our premiere. The Tammy Faye musical, it had done really well in the UK. They'd won Olivier Awards, so they did a short run in the UK to test it. They sunk millions into it in New York, Broadway, and it tanked. I have a theory about this. I think it's because Tammy Faye is too close to the bone in America, and I think that her and especially her husband, which is frustrating, are such villains for a lot of people in America, which is sort of what we're exploring. Like, why is there this excessive disgust? And in many ways, you can say with her husband, her long ex-husband, legitimate. But when you actually look at the truth of what happened to them, if you really go there and look, people don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. It's not what people think. And in fact, I feel like I'll show you.
What's the quick summary, if you don't mind?
Jim Baker was sentenced to 48 years in prison for overselling timeshares. And he has become, you know, it's often cancellation generates retrospectively the thing that somebody was accused of, because, you know, partly he had this massive bill from the IRS he had to pay, and then he became this sort of like right wing, you know, he is a psychotic who has sort of delusions that were affirmed by this catastrophic event. Anyway, yeah. But no one can ever be. I'm actually making a different film about this topic. It's a fiction film. You can never be guilty of everything you're accused of. You can never be, as a singular individual, as guilty as when you have become the scapegoat. And this was for left and right. So they actually were they were hyper-capitalist, but kind of progressive liberals. You know, they had. And this is, I'm doing a documentary about this guy that Tammy Faye interviewed, who was AIDS victim. She was one of the early people to, religious or not, interview someone with AIDS on TV, live on TV. You know, they had like a very, well, it's a long story. Let's just say, like, the majority of people we interviewed were Black people, were gay people who worked at PTL. There was, they didn't vote for Reagan. So this was all with the rise of the religious right and the moral majority. And Jerry Falwell, who was the key figure in this movement, basically came in and took the ministry at a time using an accusation that was leveled at Jim, in which there is, and let's just say, okay, should I say, the person, well, I sometimes get scared, but let's say I was threatened with murder twice.
You.
Yeah, if we went into this in the show.
Oh, so my God. Oh my God.
So we didn't.
I see.
It's not what people think it is. And I kind of wish we could say what it was, because it would explode people's concept of, let's say, a contingently embodied guilt of what was going on in America in the 1980s in this subject.
So you were, what first got you interested in this story? Like, you were onto this before it became in vogue.
Yeah. Like long before.
How did that happen? Because you had a friend. You had a friend.
Pete Rollins, best friend for a long time.
Oh.
Jay Baker, because Pete was really involved in the religious world.
Oh, yeah.
And Jay was like kind of an interesting, Christian type person. But you know,
connection. Got it.
It's my people pleasing. Like, I have this absolute fear of, I think it's also to do with contingent childhood experiences. I always had, and maybe it goes back to the Marmite analogy, like, I'm always like, you think it's this, it's not that. But the trouble is when you have this tendency and I think it might be to do with the subjective structure thing as well. You can't really truth tell. And basically, so
you said you cannot really truth tell.
No.
What does that mean?
if you expose, well, let's say if the ultimate truth is like itself
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
in our moment,
Mhm.
you know, so basically the long and short of it is it has not, it's on the shelf. Vice went bankrupt, restructured, so it's still there. But my
Vice took it on. Vice took it on.
Vice was the studio that we made it through,
Got it.
but it went bankrupt just as we finished it. So I think we were the like last project to get through the door.
Are there powerful interests that don't want it to be made?
So
Now, I know you're opposed to conspiracy. I'm opposed to conspiracy, Helen. Don't worry, but
whether left or right, you know, it's interesting. So you had, you know, the sort of Marvel, liberal versions of reality, representational versions of reality that happened in the late 10s.
Mhm.
And then you have people who are like, we're going to do it differently. And you have the likes of Angel Studios, which is just like right wing. But it's interesting. They did a film about Bonhoeffer, and I was like, way to steal an actually radical figure. Anyway, but it's because it's a theology person. But anyway, so yeah, no, if you're doing something that is like the actual point is, and I think we had enough things. You know, we had loads of access. I think it really was the Elton John participation, because older gay men loved Tammy. I mean, like, people talk about her like she is actually the second coming of Jesus Christ, like she's a saint, and I think she is.
I see. So I see. Okay.
But it's
So
very small. So I think it got that far because of the interest from people like these guys.
yeah.
But because of the role that Jim and Tammy play in American consciousness, and because there has been a really good documentary made by Fenton Bailey and Randy Barbato in 2000 about Tammy Faye, and just watch that. Just watch it. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And this was slightly different, but that's really about how she became a gay icon. And it's really about her outsiderness and how we're all outsiders, you know. So, but I think today it's very hard. So yeah, we had these contingent factors that allowed it to get to a certain point. And I think that there was this moment where there was this gold rush for people's attention. You know, there's this explosion of the streams. They all had to get loads of content to out compete each other, and basically Netflix won, you know. But then there was, you know, when the studio was hiring editors for the show, they went to 40 different editors before they found the editors, because everyone was so booked up because so much was getting made. So I can imagine there are hundreds of miniseries that were made at this time that are, you know, and again, this is also an aspect of the surplus of capitalism and the exploitation of capitalism. Is it's like the producers overproduce, you know, and then they impoverish themselves by overproducing. And then you get, you know, the monopoly. But but I think that today, where battle lines are so drawn, and even, you know, you get this sort of from the liberal side of this kind of, if you're not with us, you're against us, or if you're exposing things too much, you know, this is a conservative message or whatever. But then conservatives absolutely were the ones that threw this couple under the bus first. And it's funny, when we were getting like some of the footage, they were like, the people who own the footage, the denomination, were like, oh, don't show the queer man. You know, there's this big, really famous, you know, interview that Tammy does with this guy, Steve, who I am nearly finished a documentary about. But
wow.
It was about miracles. He was
now I understand why this has such ideological interest for you. I get it in a general sense, and I'm definitely going to watch that documentary from 2000 you recommended.
Yes,
and it sounds like this was also slightly a victim of the COVID restructuring of the industry.
I think it was that, and I think it's partly ideological, partly because it was interesting when it played at Sundance. There were certain things that happened that I'm like, you know, in this inability to read lack. You know, it's like,
and how you're right.
Saying right. This, so you're saying this. It's like, no, that's not what is being said here. Yeah. But anyway, so
because the story intrinsically upsets all of the kind of sedimented and established preconceptions
Yeah.
of consciousness, political consciousness,
Yeah.
that, like, do you feel like it was still us, even though you had to, like, bring in all of these extra executives and you had to demote yourself and the
Yeah.
proletarianization, do you still feel like you were able to get the message out that you wanted to get out?
Um, I, I really, do you know, that project saved me in lots of different ways personally.
Uh-huh.
You know, I was in a situation economically, all this kind of stuff. You know, I'm sad because I have the sickness and I would have liked to have made a version of it where I, you know, but that leads me to do another one.
I
And
see.
it would never work anyway because you can't close the gap of lack. So I keep going, I make, and essentially I'm saying the same thing in all of my films.
Sure.
So, but
And now
it's,
where can we see it now?
you can't.
Why is that?
It's owned by Vice. And I think until it gets sold,
I see.
it ever gets sold.
I see.
Yeah. But, you know, who knows? Who knows? Who knows?
Helen, thank you so much for talking to me and for this wonderful book that you've written. And I hope that it gets a very wide readership. And what do you have? What are you writing next? As, of course, a young mother, I'm sure you're working on 3 books at one time, right?
Well, I'm working on 3 films at one time.
Okay, there you go.
So slow. It's such a slow process, and it's really hard with the
Tell
baby.
tell us about them.
So one is this film about Steve Peters, Reverend Steve Peters, who was this long-standing person with AIDS for a very long time.
Mm.
And he was actually giving my husband and I marriage classes and going to marry us. And then he passed away. And actually, we were making the documentary with him. We had the interviews and stuff, and he died. So we're finishing that film. But it's very, very slow. It's very shoestring. And then I'm making a narrative film, which is sort of a riff on Camus, set in contemporary Belfast. And the main character is a guard on an army base who has an accident with his personal protection weapon. And it's sort of like a fake documentary adaptation type thing. And then I also am making a project about it's a sort of for hire project. This musician I've done a lot of work for, who's a Spanish language musician, and he's in his 60s now, and it's like a retrospective of his work. But that's also, so they take a long time, you know. So, you know, that we haven't filmed on for like a year now, and the last, so it's long and slow. But I was thinking, just you know, we were chatting of writing a book on excess at some point. And so was for Everyday Analysis thinking of writing something about being a mum in the UK, about this question of breastfeeding, because there is from a kind of like in a sort of free association kind of approach, because I have a lot to say about Britain and maternity and the structure of the economy in Britain and the responsibilization, the fracturing of the public, you know, the role of the NHS, fracturing of the public space. There's a really interesting case going on at the moment, potentially like the most major miscarriage of justice in a long period of time, a lady to do with maternity in the UK, a nurse who anyway, people can look it up. Again, it's just slightly controversial to talk about it, but those things, yeah.
Well, you can find a link to Psychocinema in the show notes, and I will also link to your film work. I think hopefully you have a page where we can.
On my website, you can see some links to some of my films are up there.
Okay. Helen, thank you so much for your work and for your insights and for joining us on Emancipations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been great chatting. Thanks.
All the best.